On the morning of the 4th of March 2026, a pale grey Tuesday that had begun with no particular institutional weight, a document was placed on the desk inside Prince William's private study at Kensington Palace by a senior aide who set it down without comment, stepped back, and waited. The document was not thick. It did not need to be. 41 pages, tabbed and time-stamped, assembled with the kind of methodical precision that communicates, before a single line has been read, that what follows has been prepared by someone who understood that the difference between an allegation and a record is the difference between something that can be dismissed and something that cannot. William read the first 12 pages without stopping. On the 13th page, he stopped. He set the document down with a care that the aide present later described as more unnerving than any visible display of emotion would have been. Then he picked up his phone and made a single call. It lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. By the time it ended, 3 things had already been set in motion that could not be recalled. And inside a residence across the city, a woman who had been telling herself for 18 months that what she was doing was manageable and private and ultimately harmless felt, without yet knowing why, the particular cold certainty that something had changed. Before starting today's royal update, I want to pause for a moment. Many of you watch these videos but haven't subscribed yet, and you don't want to miss a single royal development. Subscribing is free and keeps you up to date as each story unfolds. And while you're here, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? It's wonderful to connect with viewers from all over the world. The document had been compiled over a period of 14 weeks by Palace Security Intelligence, operating under a monitoring protocol that had been quietly activated in October 2025. Its activation had not been announced. Its existence had not been shared beyond a circle of 3 people, one of whom was William himself. What it contained was not rumor, not inference, not the kind of circumstantial proximity that could be attributed to coincidence by a sufficiently determined advocate. It was a documented pattern, specific dates, specific channels, specific categories of information that had moved from inside the royal household's private operational sphere to outside parties whose interests were not aligned with the institutions. Laid out across 41 pages in chronological order, with supporting communication records attached as appendices, it told a story that had no innocent interpretation. And the woman at its center was Princess Eugenie. To understand the gravity of what William had been handed, it is necessary to understand what Eugenie's position inside the royal framework actually represented in the post-Elizabeth landscape. She was not a working royal. She carried no formal institutional duties. But she occupied, through her bloodline, her social connections, and the particular access that proximity to the senior family quietly confers, a position that placed her inside the perimeter of the monarchy's most sensitive operational conversations without placing her under the governance structures that regulated how that information could be used. She moved between institutional and private life with a fluidity that had previously seemed unremarkable. It no longer seemed unremarkable. Because the record William was reading demonstrated, with methodical and devastating clarity, that the fluidity had been exploited, not carelessly, not impulsively, deliberately, consistently, and across a period of time long enough to constitute a pattern that the word mistake could not reach. Princess Beatrice's position in the document was different in kind, but not in consequence. She had not participated in the external communications channel her sister had established. She had not shared institutional information or engaged with the external parties whose interests had been served by Eugenie's conduct. But she had known, not everything and not from the beginning, but enough. 2 conversations, documented in their own right within the record's appendices, showed Beatrice raising concern in November 2025 and again in December, expressing discomfort with the risks of what her sister was doing in terms that made her awareness of its general nature unambiguous. Eugenie had reassured her. The reassurances, measured against what the subsequent record showed had continued to occur after they were given, had not been honest. Beatrice had accepted them because she loved her sister, and because the alternative to accepting them was a confrontation she had not felt equipped to force. That choice, made in loyalty and made in love, had drawn her into a situation whose dimensions she had not fully seen and could not now exit cleanly. William's call, those 4 minutes and 11 seconds, had been to the one person he trusted to tell him whether what he was holding was as serious as it appeared and what the institution required him to do with it. The answer to the first question was yes. The answer to the second question was the beginning of everything that followed. The external communications channel had begun, as these things often do, with something that was genuinely and entirely innocent. In the spring of 2024, Eugenie had been introduced through a mutual social connection to a media figure with long-standing experience in royal affairs coverage and a reputation carefully maintained for discretion and institutional sympathy. The early conversations were social, dinners, events. The kind of proximity that accumulates naturally between people who move in overlapping circles and share enough reference points to make conversation easy. Nothing was shared that could not have appeared in a public briefing. Nothing was requested that felt like anything other than the normal curiosity of someone professionally engaged with the world Eugenie inhabited. And then, gradually, and with a patience that suggested the approach had been considered carefully before it was deployed, the nature of the conversations began to shift. By September 2024, Palace Security Intelligence had flagged the frequency of contact between Eugenie and the media figure as warranting observation. The flag was routine, the kind generated automatically by monitoring systems that track communication patterns between royal household adjacencies and known media contacts above a certain threshold of frequency. What elevated it from routine to active in October 2025 was the identification of a second external party, a commercial entity with active financial interests in royal licensing and heritage territory, whose principal had begun appearing in communication records shared with the first. The geometry of the three-way connection, when mapped by analysts who understood what they were looking at, described something that the word network was not too strong to apply to. Eugenie was at its center, and the information moving outward from that center included details about scheduling, institutional priorities, and internal family dynamics that had no business traveling in the direction they were traveling. The financial dimension was identified in December 2025 and transformed the nature of what was being documented. 2 payments, routed through a consultancy registered in a jurisdiction that added a layer of distance from direct attribution, had been made to an account with demonstrable connections to Eugenie's personal financial network. The amounts were not large enough to suggest primary motivation. They were large enough to establish a transactional character to what might otherwise have been framed as social indiscretion. Palace legal advisors, when the payments were identified and their routing traced, used a word in their internal assessment that no one in the room had wanted to hear: consideration. The legal weight of that word, in the context of information sharing between a royal household adjacency and external commercial interests, was not ambiguous. It transformed the record from a disciplinary matter into something that required a different category of institutional response entirely. Beatrice had sensed something was wrong before she had specifics to attach the feeling to. Her November 2025 conversation with Eugenie had been prompted by a comment made at a family gathering that had struck her as oddly informed, the kind of comment that implies access to a conversation one should not have been part of. She had raised it privately, carefully, in the way of someone who wants to be wrong. Eugenie's response had been fluent and reassuring, and as the record later confirmed, substantially untrue. The December conversation had been more direct. Beatrice had seen something, a message notification on Eugenie's phone whose sender she recognized and whose presence in her sister's contact list she could not account for. She had asked directly. The answer she received closed the conversation without resolving it. She had not pushed further. That decision, made in the particular anguish of someone who loves a person more than they fear what the truth about that person might cost them, was the decision that had placed Beatrice inside the perimeter of a situation she had not created and could not now leave without damage following her out. The meeting invitation arrived at Eugenie's residence through formal palace channels on the morning of the 7th of March 2026. Not a phone call, not a personal message. A formal written communication on official Kensington Palace stationery requesting her attendance at a meeting to be held at 11 o'clock the following morning. The formality was the message. Eugenie understood it immediately and completely, in the way that people who have been managing a private anxiety for weeks understand the signal that confirms the anxiety was justified. She spent the remainder of that day and most of the night preparing. She constructed an explanation that she had been refining in her head for longer than she cared to admit, one that reframed the communications channel as social rather than operational, the financial transactions as unrelated consulting work, and the overall pattern as a series of unconnected events that only appeared connected when viewed through the distorting lens of institutional suspicion. It was a coherent explanation. She had rehearsed it until it felt almost true. It did not survive contact with the room. William had placed a senior legal advisor at the table before Eugenie arrived. The advisor's presence communicated, with the precision of a signal that required no decoding, that what was about to occur was not a family conversation. It was an institutional proceeding. William himself was composed in a manner that Eugenie later described to a confidant as the most frightening version of him she had ever encountered, because composure of that particular quality, total and deliberate, and entirely without the emotional warmth that normally characterized even his most serious conversations, meant that the emotional dimension of their relationship had been consciously set aside. He was not her cousin in that room. He was the institution. And the institution had read every page. He did not begin with an accusation. He placed the first tabbed section of the document on the table and invited her to look at it. Then the second, then the third. With each placement, silent and unhurried, the architecture of Eugenie's prepared explanation lost another supporting wall. By the fourth tab, she had stopped looking at the documents and was looking at William instead, searching his face for the opening that would allow her to reframe what was on the table. She did not find it. When she finally spoke, what emerged was not her rehearsed explanation, but something rawer and less constructed, a fractured attempt to communicate that she had not understood the full implications, had not intended the institutional damage, had believed at each individual step that what she was doing was contained and manageable. William listened to all of it without interruption. Then he said, with a quietness that filled the room more completely than volume could have, that what she had intended was noted, and that what had occurred was documented, and that the two were not the same thing. Beatrice's meeting happened the same afternoon in a different room, with a different senior aide and a notably different emotional temperature. She was shown only the portion of the record that included her own November and December conversations with Eugenie, the evidence of her awareness rather than her participation. Her breakdown, unlike Eugenie's fractured panic, was quiet and immediate. She did not attempt an explanation. She did not construct a refrain. She read the pages she was shown, set them down, and placed both hands flat on the table in front of her in a gesture the aide present described as someone physically steadying themselves against a reality they had feared and now had to inhabit. She asked only one question: "Does she know I'm here?" The answer was yes. Beatrice nodded once and said nothing further for a long time. In the days that followed, both women withdrew completely. Engagements were cancelled without explanation. Social media fell silent in the particular total way that signals institutional instruction rather than personal choice. Aides who had been accessible became unreachable, and inside the palace, in the corridors and meeting rooms where institutional weather is read most accurately, the question that moved through every conversation was the same: what William would do next. The terms were delivered on the morning of the 11th of March 2026, in a document that was itself a statement of intent before its contents had been read. 12 pages, formally structured, witnessed by 2 senior palace legal advisors and 1 representative of the royal household's constitutional oversight unit, whose involvement signaled that what was being presented carried institutional rather than merely personal authority. William had spent 4 days constructing the framework, not alone and not quickly, but with the methodical care of someone who understood that the terms he set would define not just what happened to Beatrice and Eugenie, but what the monarchy signaled about how it handled the gap between the behavior it required and the behavior it sometimes received from within its own bloodline. The terms were neither punitive nor lenient. They were, in the precise sense that the word implies, institutional. They addressed the conduct that had occurred, the conditions under which the matter would be contained, and the future framework within which both women's relationship to the royal household would operate. They were, in short, the document of an institution choosing to protect itself by protecting the people it could not afford to lose, while making absolutely clear that the protection came with a permanent and documented accountability attached. The specific terms required the immediate and complete cessation of all communication with the two external parties identified in the record. They required the formal withdrawal of Eugenie from two institutional adjacencies she had established over the preceding 18 months, both of which were quietly dissolved without public explanation in the weeks that followed. They required a 6-month supervised engagement review administered by a senior palace official, during which any external communication touching on institutional matters would require prior clearance through a designated channel. And they required one public gesture, unannounced and unexplained, that would signal within the family's internal register that a recalibration had occurred and that its terms had been accepted. Princess Anne had been involved in drafting the terms from the third day of William's 4-day construction process. Her contribution was, characteristically, the clause that caused the most resistance and that mattered the most. It required that Eugenie provide, in writing and in her own words, a formal account of the conduct as she understood it, to be sealed within the palace's private institutional record and held there permanently, not for use, not as a weapon, as a truth. Anne's reasoning, when she explained it to William in the conversation that preceded its inclusion, was the reasoning of someone who had spent a lifetime understanding what institutions require to remain honest about themselves. If she writes it herself, Anne said, she cannot later tell herself it was misrepresented. The record will always know what she knew. Eugenie's legal advisor had resisted the clause for 6 hours before accepting it. The acceptance itself told a story about how completely the room understood the alternative. Beatrice's response to the terms was immediate and unqualified. Her private meeting with William afterward lasted 12 minutes. What was said in those 12 minutes has not been disclosed by anyone present. What one witness observed, standing outside the closed door when it opened, was that both of them looked like people who had carried something heavy for a long time and had found, in the preceding 12 minutes, a way to set it down that did not require either of them to pretend it had never been heavy. It was not a full restoration. It was the beginning of one. And beginnings, in the particular geography of royal family dynamics, were more than most ruptures of this kind ever achieved. 6 weeks after the terms were accepted and signed, Beatrice and Eugenie appeared together at a heritage education event in Windsor. The palace listing for the engagement was brief. No statement accompanied it. No special emphasis was placed on the fact that both sisters were present, which was itself the emphasis. They arrived together, they stayed for 2 hours, they spoke to students and archivists and local educators with the focused attention of people who understood that the work in front of them was the only appropriate response to everything that had preceded it. The photographs showed 2 women who looked, to anyone reading them without context, like precisely what they were, princesses doing their job. To anyone reading them with context, they showed something more specific and more quietly remarkable. 2 women who had been handed a consequence and had chosen, with it, to build something rather than disappear from it. William's position in the aftermath was described by those closest to him as the position of someone who had made the right decision and found that the right decision was also the lonelier one. Public exposure would have been comprehensible. It would have had a shape that people could recognize and respond to. What he had chosen instead was invisible from the outside and therefore uncelebrable. He had been handed a weapon of considerable destructive power and had used it to draft a governance clause and seal a document and arrange a supervised engagement review. He had protected the institution by refusing to perform its protection publicly. That, in the end, was what those who understood the full story would later identify as the truest measure of his readiness for what was coming. Not the discovery, not the confrontation, but the restraint. The palace's official governance framework was updated quietly in the final week of March. a clause inserted into the section governing royal household adjacency communications with such institutional modesty that only a careful reader would notice it was new. It established a formal clearance protocol for external communications touching on institutional matters, applicable to all members of the extended royal family regardless of working status. No names were attached to it. No explanatory note accompanied it, just the clause, the date, and the knowledge, held by those few who understood its origin, that it existed because someone had chosen to turn a private reckoning into a permanent institutional protection. The monarchy had not announced what it had survived. It had simply become, in one quiet clause on one unremarked page, slightly more capable of surviving it again. Many of you watch these videos but haven't subscribed yet, and you don't want to miss a single royal development. Subscribing is free and keeps you up to date as each story unfolds. And while you're here, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? It's wonderful to connect with viewers from all over the world.